Welcome to my examples and anecdotes video for the 4 quadrants of knowledge. So in this video, I kind of just want to give some personal examples, things that just made me shake my head or just be like, what are people doing kind of a thing. The first story I want to share is about this Korean guy that I met and something he told me he was doing to change his life and change his diet. So I live in China and I coach dodgeball for adults. I have like an evening class coaching dodgeball, and this Korean guy's come multiple times to my class. He's a really cool dude. He's pretty funny. So I don't coach during the winter, and this Korean guy had come before in like the fall and summer from before, and then we close for the winter and then we redo it again in the spring. And so he came in the spring and he was like a lot more lean and a lot more cut up, but he was like much skinnier too. And so we played dodgeball, and then afterwards he came up to me and he was telling me that he started a new diet and he's just like cut all carbs from his diet. And then he started like putting butter in his coffee and, doing butter coffee. And then he told me that he like was getting up super early and he only needed like 4.5 hours of sleep or something like that. And I think I remember he said he was going to like not do that anymore because he was too tired. He was going to go back to like a normal 8 hours of sleep. He started this by asking me like, hey man, have you like heard of butter coffee? And I was thinking to myself like, butter coffee? Yeah, you mean like that thing back from like the 90s where women were doing that as a weight loss thing with like the grapefruit diet and the butter coffee diet? Yes, I've heard of the butter coffee diet. That's been around forever. And he was like, oh yeah, I'm doing that now. And I was thinking like, trying to lose weight. I guess that's how you got so lean. And he was like, yeah, I watched some videos about it. It's like I'm trying to get shredded and keep my energy up, and just get on my grind. And I was just thinking like, oh, okay, so the butter coffee thing is not marketed towards women anymore. Now it's marketed towards like up and coming Sigma grind set gym bros. I thought, okay, this is funny, but like, all right, I mean, like, I don't know if it's that harmful to put butter in your coffee, but I kind of tried to tell him, yeah, I mean, like, sure, it's caffeine and some saturated fats. I don't really know exactly what that's doing for, but I don't think that's like solving your problems. And then he continued to tell me that since he cut carbs out of his diet, he was like doing really good and he really loved it. And I was like, okay, man. And I was just trying to tell him like, hey, by the way, like you should probably have some carbs some days. Like you don't want to go into acetosis or ketosis where you're breaking down proteins in your body and is making your body acidic. I told him you don't want this to happen. It's really unhealthy. So I suggested that he continue to eat some carbs. I said, maybe 2 days a week, still get some carbs, maybe make it some complex carbs, and get some good healthy carbs into your diet. And he was like, complex carbs? What's that? And I said, you don't know what complex carbs and simple carbs are? And he's like, no, I'll have to look into that. And I was like, yeah, you should look that up because complex carbs are good for you, much better than simple carbs for you. And I suggest that you just get some. I would just be cautious, dude. Like, try to make sure you're getting enough sleep. Don't cut on meals completely and just do butter coffee. I was trying to not just cut into the guy, but suggest that he doesn't just follow some like YouTube shorts or Instagram shorts, like videos that are just some dude trying to like sell him some pills or sell him some protein powder, through his link or something like that. And the Korean guy, and again, like language is not an issue here. This guy's English was fantastic. He had studied in the US before, so this wasn't like a second language issue like translation or language barrier issue. So then as he turns to leave, he's like, yeah, man, like, I don't know, I just feel like so good. I think I'm going to keep going with it. And I said, okay, man, I just exercise some caution, try to get some complex carbs in there. Like, I wouldn't cut anything out completely. That's not really good for your nutrition and your health overall. And he's like, yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I'll think about doing that. That's probably a good idea. I'm thinking like, okay, good. I'm getting through to him a little bit. And then he goes, you know what I'm really going to miss though? I'm going to miss donuts and fries and white rice. He's like, I'm Asian, so like, I like white rice, but donuts and fries, man. And I'm like, are you serious? Donuts and fries? Yeah, if you cut donuts and fries from your diet, of course you're going to feel better. You're going to feel like you have a ton more energy. It's not the butter coffee that's making you feel better and more energized. It's because you're not on like sugar lows and lethargic from like oversaturated fats and like simple carbs. And white rice is just a glucose spike as well. All of these things are not good for your overall quadrant 4 health and nutrition. So of course, if this is your diet, you're not going to feel great. But cutting them and following a quadrant 2 solution to a major quadrant 4 macro science, which is nutrition, is not going to solve your problem really. It's not going to create a long-lasting, permanent, healthy increase in your life. He's just cut some really bad things out of his diet, and he's seeing some results from that. But there's a lot more to it that's going on under the surface, and he doesn't even know what complex carbs are. I was like, are you serious? You don't even know what a complex carb and a simple carb is, and yet you're doing things like going, I'm going to cut all carbs out of my diet. Like, have oats, barley, rye, quinoa. Like, those things are great for you, and they're loaded with vitamins and minerals. They're amazing for your macro science quadrant 4 nutrition. And no, just cutting them out does not boost your nutrition score or whatever. It's not going to help you on your Sigma grind or help you shred up or anything like that, because that's not how simple nutrition is. And it just blew my mind. Like, this guy knows so little about nutrition. I mean, I've taken like 3 years up to the 300 level A&P course, and I took like some nutrition courses and some organic chemistry and microbiology classes when I was in college. And I'm no expert on it, but I just remember that, yes, like complex carbs are very different than simple carbs. And I remember how nutrition works in your body. And it's just, you can't do some simple thing like just cut this or just put butter in your coffee. You're going to feel amazing. And so these videos of these, wherever he was getting this advice, and he said he was just listening to, he found like some content creators online that were suggesting this. And I asked him, like, it was at Shorts, and he was saying, like, yeah, there's a lot of short videos about it. It's very clear. He was like, he wasn't like, oh, they're short videos, so it's not as good. You got to be cautious. He was like, yeah, it's easy to consume. It's like well compacted, like information just delivered straight because they're in short videos. And I just thought, like, this is so bizarre. He knows so little, and yet he's dependent so much. And the guys, the content creators that are using this quadrant 2 formula to solve a quadrant 4 problem are banking off that you have really unhealthy things like the donuts and the rice and the fries, and you're going to cut that and you're going to feel so much better, and you're going to think, because you don't understand this is a quadrant 4 issue, that it was the butter coffee, or it was the getting up at 4 a.m., or it was their nutritional meal supplement that you bought. And so you're going to keep going for it, and you're going to get hooked into a scam, and you're also going to get hooked into something like a long-term malnutritious, unhealthy lifestyle, because you don't understand what you're doing. So that's the first major example where I think this just really hit me, like, this guy does not understand nutrition, quadrant 2, quadrant 4 differences. And he's hurting himself by not identifying which quadrant the problem that he's trying to solve is, and therefore which quadrant the solution should come from. I want to give one really big example of how all these quadrants can fit together. A common thing that you hear people say when talking about these quadrants is a distinction between quadrant 3 and quadrant 4. And that is that you could see the routines, the systems, the laws, the organization. You could see like bus routes, delivery systems, things like that. And from that, you could infer certain cultural things, or from certain cultural things, you could guess at the structures that are probably implemented. Rice is a really big agricultural crop here, and it's a really big part of their industry. So if you saw all of these sort of shipping routes or trucking routes, and you saw that the manifest and the cargo is often rice, if you saw like numbers of how many tons of rice, etc., are transported to and from different provinces and that sort of thing, you could see that as a quadrant 4 fact. That is knowledge in the quadrant 4. You're seeing external things, really structural things. You might also see that there's government subsidies being given to the agricultural workers that are growing rice. Now, from this fact, you could infer, well, I bet that there's a culture of eating rice here. And there's dishes with rice, there's different things that they do with rice, like rice puddings, rice noodles, fried rice, rice desserts, you name it. You got a lot of stuff with rice. So from seeing a quadrant 4 structural thing, government subsidies for rice and support for rice farmers, delivery routes and things like that for rice, you could see that there's a culture of rice. But you could also see that, well, if the government is subsidizing it and the government is offering incentives for people to be farmers growing rice, well, that might mean that a lot of young people are moving away from rural areas and wanting to be farmers and such like that and moving into city areas. So that would be a cultural thing, that there's a movement away from the rural and the agricultural roots and a movement towards bigger cities and bigger city culture and jobs and opportunities there. Now that you're in the quadrant 3, you can understand, well, individuals participate within quadrant 3, collective, and from there you could infer that individuals in quadrant 1 are probably not finding the agricultural rural life to be very interesting or sexy or attractive or anything like that. You could then probably infer that there is a large social media presence of individuals in quadrant 1 and collective quadrant 3 consumption of social media. And on social media, the agricultural rural farming life is not really being advertised or portrayed as this really alluring thing. So individuals are moving away from agriculture and farming. And you could guess all this because you are seeing that the government is offering benefits and bonuses for people to try to do that, or for their existing ones to try to make sure those systems don't fail, because quadrant 3, so much of their culture, and quadrant 4, their economic structure, relies on the fact that they keep growing rice. You might also be able to guess that probably the structure there to support rice farmers is not going to be that great. The salaries, the benefits, and things like that might be a little bit extra, but it's not that much because it's not attracting individuals back to the rural area, because people still need that material conditions to live. And if they made a lot of money from doing rice farming, then they'd probably still choose that because they could buy products, nice cars, nice houses, etc., have a really cushy lifestyle that does seem sexy that they can portray then on social media. So you could then guess that I bet the structural benefits in quadrant 4 are not actually that great to bring the young people back to doing farming. You could also infer that due to the quadrant 3 rice eating culture that people share, that in quadrant 2, there's a lot of rice consumption and rice in people's diets, which would mean a pretty high level of glucose and blood sugar, which you might then be able to infer in quadrant 4 that there are institutions or hospitals or government services to solve these issues that might arise from high sugar, high glucose diets, and that might be tackling these sort of issues in the health. You might also see that due to that sugar spike, when eating a big lunch of white rice, that you have an afternoon napping culture here, which you do. A lot of people eat like a really big pile of rice, like a huge amount of white rice for lunch, and then they take a nap. And a lot of lunch breaks for businesses are fairly long. People take naps in their offices sometimes, at schools. Everybody's allowed to take a nap. People ask me all the time, like, are you going to go take a nap? Are you going to go rest now? So there's this culture of taking this afternoon nap after a big rice lunch. And this all has to do with the relationship of quadrant 2, glucose in your blood, can result to a cultural quadrant 3 relationship of taking an afternoon nap. And it's just sort of interesting how all of this stuff can be related, all from seeing like, oh, they have a lot of rice shipping routes and trade routes, and their numbers are really high in rice growing and rice selling and exporting. So you can see, okay, there's so many structures built on this, there's culture built on this, individuals respond to it in certain ways, their diet, the chemicals in their body, etc., are also changed, all because this rice culture and structure and individual relationship and external relationships are all intertwined. So a piece of knowledge does not only exist on one quadrant, right? It can exist in multiple quadrants. But it is interesting, I think, to see how these things are related. And of course, like everything that I see here related here are not the only causes as to why there's afternoon napping culture here. And knowing all of this, if the government wants to do something like try to make it more appealing for young people to be farmers, well, that's probably because of a quadrant 1 or a quadrant 4 thing. Quadrant 1, they're just not drawn to that rural life. It's not sexy. It's not hopping on social media. It's not cool. It's not trending, etc. Right? So they could try to launch some ad campaigns and some targeted videos and whatever that are trying to make it seem like it's cool to go be a farmer and to make it seem like that life is sexy and interesting and to try to get people to go back to that. Or they could tackle the issue from quadrant 4, try to make much better services, much better benefits, better bonuses, like to buy a house, buy a car, etc., things like that, which there are some, and you can see that. But the fact that there are some and they're not that much of like a boon and a benefit to the people, and the people aren't coming back to it, means that the problem still exists. So I just think it's interesting seeing how all this stuff can be related. You can follow a track line through different quadrants. Another specific example I want to talk about is just expanding on the sort of conservative versus left-wing viewpoint. And that is the whole like quadrant 1 versus quadrant 3 or 4 solutions. Quadrant 1 often being just like pull yourself up by the bootstraps, just do better, be the change you want to see in the world. And again, like that's good advice if you just want to improve yourself. Like if you want to get into psychology and self-help for actual deep personal improvement, not just like how to be cool and make more money and make girls like you, but actual like that, then go for it. But leftists, from the other perspective, they often try to solve issues from quadrant 3 and quadrant 4. And a lot of issues need to be solved with that because our societies have grown so big, these systems so complex, and also not everybody using that system, using that complex system, coming from the same background in the same place. So the individuals coming into each of these cultural, quadrant 3, or structural, in society, quadrant 4, systems are the same individual. So the individual quadrant that they're coming from cannot be the solution origin to just pull up your bootstraps, do these things, and it's going to make your life better because everybody's coming from a different quadrant 1 start point, especially in the US where we are that classic melting pot, of cultures and people coming here. Some of the issues are indeed very personal and need a lot of personal focus to improve them. And they also need a very different quadrant 3 cultural mindset, value system, etc., to let the quadrant 4 systems work. One example, in Portland, Oregon, they tried to revise the laws to allow there to be like no criminalization of certain lesser amounts of drugs being sold. And I have some friends that live there, and I asked them recently, like, what happened with that situation? And they said, what's happened is they've basically become these open air drug markets where people just on the street, and the open air just means it's happening in like broad daylight and just on the street or whatever, not even in like an enclosed location or, trying to hide it. It's just happening because it's not criminalized to any degree. And what we tried doing with many of these initiatives, and there's other cities that tried doing this as well, it's not just Portland, I bring that up because I have friends that live there and I visit there a couple times a year usually. We modeled it after many European countries like in Portugal or Amsterdam that have much more lenient, progressive, or open laws about drugs and things like that. But the thing is, the European mindset in general is completely different. European quadrant 1 and quadrant 3, and I say this living in China, I don't have any American friends here. I have only other European friends and Chinese friends. Europeans are very, very different in their individual mindset and their cultural mindset than Americans are. And when we tried to implement many of those same quadrant 4 structural changes and laws, it flopped because our cultural mindset is very different and our individual mindset is very different. So the problem is not in quadrant 4, but it is in quadrant 3. And this is something I've talked about with American friends, and this is something I've talked about with European friends. And it's a very interesting issue. But I think that the solution comes with a combination of quadrant 4 structures, laws, legislation, and understanding things about the drugs and homelessness issues like that. But there also needs to be a direct education and improvement of people's quadrant 1 status, which we just don't do in the US at all. Even with the harm reduction facilities that are meant to reduce like ODing and deaths and obviously harm to individuals that are going to be doing drugs, not legalizing and not saying it's okay, but we're just trying to reduce human harm and death and suffering when it occurs, which I think is a noble thing to do. But in our quadrant 3 culture, it flops because our quadrant 3 is very different from the other quadrant 3s in the world where that quadrant 4 structure works. And likewise, in other European places, when it comes to homeless, they offer a program where it's housing first, and then you can work on like the personal problems. So basically, quadrant 4 first, solve those problems, but in their societies, quadrant 1 and 3 are different than ours. And they also have a much heavier focus on education there, and they have a much heavier focus on personal responsibility in a society than we do. I know this is a hot topic, and many people are probably really close to their hearts about this, but it is something that I find interesting talking with different people that come from different individual groups and different cultural groups, trying to solve the same issues in a society, but the same type of solution is not working across different quadrant 3 and quadrant 1 relationships. When those change, the structure changes as well. So that's my examples and anecdotes video. I think if you want to contradict what I say, put it below. If you have other examples or anecdotes from your own life that you want to add to help us all sort of understand, like, yeah, there's things that we see that can help us understand how to categorize knowledge in this 4-quadrant system, which can help us understand arguments, other people, solutions, and help us sort of not get scammed and screwed over by people who are going to use a deficiency of that understanding to benefit themselves and, screw us over. Want to write something down below, some other examples from your life, that would be great. I would learn from them, others could learn from them. That's my goal here. Thank you.